Hello, everyone. We now start our final session for this afternoon on our half-day online conference, Linkages, One Tertiary Education System. Welcome back to those of you who've been participating earlier today in our previous two sessions. As we may have new audience members joining, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples here today. This is a panel session, and we are going to try and leave a few minutes at the end for questions. Our questions at the end will we will finish the session bang on 4:30 Australian Eastern Daylight Time. I'd like to welcome then the panellists who are with us now. And firstly, can I welcome Catriona Jackson, who is the Chief Executive of Universities Australia. I've been very fortunate this year to have spent quite a bit of time with Catriona as we have explored and talked about the Accord in various contexts we've been in. So we are delighted to have you with us, Catriona. Thank you very much. Can I also welcome Simon Walker, who was here, and now we may have lost Simon. Simon, welcome. I'm sure you'll pop back in a few minutes. Welcome to Simon Walker. Simon is the Managing Director of NCVER. For all of you who work in the vet sector, you are well aware of the tremendous work that NCVER does in vet research. And Simon was saying earlier that the focus they do have is on vet research, but nonetheless, they've done some important work around the linkages between higher education and vocational education. So I'm sure Simon will pop back in a tick. Then we also welcome, and we don't have Kelly on yet, but Kelly may come in as in the duration, Kelly Pearce, who's First Assistant Secretary of the Higher Education Division for the Department of Education. Kelly has been leading the Accord work from the Secretariat point of view. Simon's back. We've already welcomed you, Simon, so good to have you back with us now.
Sorry about that.
That's good. It's good to see you here. So Kelly, if Kelly comes in, that's who Kelly is as she joins us, First Assistant Secretary, Higher Education Division, Department of Education. And then we have three TAFE Directors Australia members who are joining the panel today. Firstly, can I welcome David Coltman, who's Chief Executive of TAFE SA, and David is the Deputy Chair of TDA Board. And can I also welcome Peter Heilbuth, who's the Deputy Vice President of Vet and Business Development from Central Queensland University and one of TDA's dual sector members. And finally, and I'm going to hand across in a minute to Mary Faraone. Welcome and thank you, Mary. Mary is the TDA Board Chair. She is also Chief Executive of Holmesglen Institute, and Mary is our facilitator for this panel this afternoon. Thank you all. Over to you, Mary.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and thanks for everyone who's attending, and thank you to our panellists today. I have to say I've been listening since 1 o'clock today, and it's been a fantastic workshop. Great to hear from the Minister, albeit very brief, and also with Jenny and Megan and Sally. And before I sort of get into this panel, I would just like to say a great thanks to TDA and the team for putting together what's been a really successful afternoon today. Lots of thought-provoking things that came out of the sessions today, and in particular linking to what we're talking about today about is harmonisation or one tertiary education system, and is harmonisation possible? Certainly, Sally talked about a learner-centric, connected, cohesive, harmonised tertiary system, which I really liked. And Jenny Macklin also talked about, when she was talking about the Tertiary Education Commission, that the idea behind it is that it's an institutional structure in a way to bring people together around the table to talk about things. And what struck me about that was yesterday I was involved in a round table discussion with a number of, it was Victorian based, a number of VCs from Victoria and some TAFE institutes. And one of the people there commented that it's the first time that universities and TAFE leaders have got together in that way to talk about these sorts of issues, not about international education or specific topics, but for the first time to actually talk about the ideas that have been generating with the Commonwealth government. So I thought that was really interesting. And also a few of us were at the JSA symposium a couple of weeks ago in Canberra, which also focused on the new skills, but both Catriona and I were on a very similar panel talking about harmonisation and how VET and higher ed can work better together. And it's a real focus of the Commonwealth government. And certainly the new Centres of Excellence will be a vehicle led by TAFE to strengthen collaboration with universities. And we know that there's lots of good examples out there already. Many of us in the tertiary sector are keen to see the Higher Education Accord's final report, but I think a clear message has been, how do we realise a tertiary sector which can deliver access and equity, as Jenny talked about, and deliver those targets or deliver on those targets. And one way to think about higher ed and TAFE as tertiary providers, different types of providers, but within a tertiary landscape, but working together to deliver government goals. So, as Jenny said, we've got a fantastic panel, and I can see that Kelly has now joined us. Kelly, so fantastic to see that you are with the panel. But the first question I'm going to ask all the panelists is, what do you understand harmonisation to mean in this context? So I'm going to start with David Coltman.
Thanks, Mary. I think when we're talking about harmonisation, we're talking about a lack of hard boundaries between the sector, or between different players and contributors of the sector. So it's how the different players, parts of an organisation come together is where I see the harmonisation occurring.
Fantastic, thank you. Peter?
Thanks, Mary. I think language is often instructive, and I think the deliberate use of this term harmonisation really reflects that. You know, we're not talking about integration or merger or centralisation, which have been themes throughout, recurring themes throughout certainly my TAFE and vocational career, but harmonisation or the act of, I guess, bringing organisations that are compatible together.
Great. And I think it's interesting, sometimes people use the word integration, harmonisation as interchangeable, but they are quite different. Catriona?
Mary, you start with the great big questions, don't you?
I know. And then we get more focused as we go down.
Absolutely. Look, I agree with everything Peter just said. I tend to use an overly long word here. I think integration is the wrong word, because it makes it sound like we're all going to be the same, and we're not going to all be the same. TAFE and higher education have so many things in common, so many good things to do in closer contact, but we're not exactly the same. I say interoperability. I know it's an overly long word, and I'm not big on overly long words, but it means just that we connect better together. We operate and harmony is good too, in a harmonious way, which just means that the student can get what they want from whichever bit of a sector is appropriate at whatever period of it in their lives. We all know that people have a whole pile of different careers in their life now, totally different to how it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. So they need to be able to pick from pieces of university education, pieces from vocational education, and somehow have a harmonious, coherent whole out of that lot that really suits their purposes and means that they're making the biggest contribution they can make.
Yeah, I like the word interoperability as well. I think a lot of people don't use it because it's quite hard to say. But but I think what we just heard with Sally and Megan as well, the AQF may be, or the proposed new AQF may be the vehicle to do what you were just talking about. Simon, what's your view? What is harmonisation? What do you understand by it?
Well, I'm glad Catriona raised that, because I think interoperability is a really good expression. And when I first read this, I thought, well, the best answer is what harmonisation is not, which is a structural unification or a standardisation of the different missions and ways that we work. So that is not what harmonisation is. I take your point, Peter, about harmonisation, but it has its own connotations in VET, because having worked as a bureaucrat across government policy areas, there was and still is a long time ambition to harmonise the apprenticeship system across states and territories. So it's a bit of a dirty word in some ways, harmonisation, perhaps not quite the same connotation that you would accord to it. So yeah, I think this idea of interoperability, the idea of a seamless, fluid transition between the sectors as and when students need, so keep it student-centric in that sense. But to maintain the distinct missions and specialisations, I think is also important.
Yeah, and I think that's why that learner-centric or student-centric approach, I think, is really important, what Sally alluded to. Kelly. So we may have lost Kelly. Kelly, can you hear us? Okay, we might move on and hope that Kelly is able to join us. So I'm now going to ask David, Peter and Catriona the same question. Why is harmonisation important? And what specific examples are there of improved educational outcomes from harmonisation? I'll start with you, Peter.
Thanks, Mary. I think it's really important. You know, for too long, the post-secondary or tertiary sectors have been set against each other, whether you know, on purpose, politically, or indeed just by nature of people's perceptions. I think there's enormous value to be had in bringing the sectors together, particularly from a student-focused perspective, and particularly for regional areas such as the one in which Central Queensland University, as the name suggests, works predominantly in. From that student perspective, how great is it that someone can potentially leave school or indeed want to come back to training after being in the workforce and approach one organisation, or at least a collection of organisations that share the same goals and actually have arrangements between them, can support those students through their pathway, whether that pathway is linear or across or up or down, and certainly can support those students through their lifelong learning journey. So for all those reasons, I think it's enormously important. I'm not sure we're at that point yet, but I think we're probably closer to that point than we've been for a while. And I think there's fabulous opportunities in front of all of us now, that are coming up right now for us to actually start to make some real inroads to a much more harmonised system.
Peter, interesting. I mean, you're from a dual sector institution, university. Do you think harmonisation is easier in your institute from the VET to the higher ed perspective for students to navigate?
Yeah, I think like anything, I think lived experience is enormously useful. CQUniversity hasn't been a dual sector forever. We're probably into our 8th or our 9th year now, and it would be perfectly fair to say that the realities of differing regulation, compliance, governance, funding, course development, course accreditation, etc., all play a part in actually making a harmonized or even one organization, in the case of a dual sector system, quite difficult. What we do in a dual sector is we work really hard behind the scenes to try and make it as seamless as possible for the end users, the students, or indeed the industry. But the fact is, it's a pretty hard road.
All right, we won't delve too far into the hard road, but we might come back to it because it is an interesting example of where harmonisation should work really well. Catriona, I might then go to you on this question. You're on mute.
Excuse me, you think you'd have this right by now, wouldn't you, for heaven's sake? Look, I think the answer here is that this is already happening. Doesn't mean that all the systems are in place the way they should be. But if you look at the number of TAFE students who've already got a university degree, that's gone up from about 15% to about 20% over the last 5 years or so. So there's already a shift. It's not particularly visible, students doing some vet and some university. And I think people outside the sector think it never happens. You are defined as one or defined as the other. And that's just not the case. What we need to do is, and look, I'm stealing this from Jenny Dodge. We need to make sure that, I mean, in some cases, we need to simplify things so that they can link better together. I am not an expert in TAFE, but I'm reliably informed that it's fairly complex. And the way things are assessed is fairly complex. Far be it from me to imply that things are vaguely similar in universities, but there is certainly a fair amount of complexity. So we just need to look at both systems and work out how they can work better together. And so why do we want to do that? The students are voting with their feet. I mean, universities, the place I know most about, are not like they were when I was a kid at university. Almost everyone was the same age as me, 17, 18, 19. Now you walk onto a university campus and more than half the students are mature age. This is just one indication of the enormous shift. People are starting their educational journey later. They're dipping in and out. They want some vet. They want some university at different periods in their life. They want to reskill, upskill. They want to change careers. So it's our duty to make sure this works. And there's absolutely no lack of push, of motivation from the general public for us to get these structures right so they can get the kind of education they want when they want it. We've got a great opportunity right now with the Universities Accord, with the skills agreement agreed by skills ministers just a couple of days ago now, a real coming together of people around the table saying, let's actually put all the resources from the feds and the states, into the middle of a table in a sense, and work out how we can actually do the best thing for the students with that resource and overcome just the tiny challenges of things like federation. We're up for it.
Okay, I might come back to you, Catriona, just about, do you think the willingness of, because this is about, in many respects, it's been pushed by the skills minister, but also through the Accord, the willingness of your members to actually embrace this? Do you think there is a real willingness across the university landscape about embracing harmonisation? They're very big institutions. They've got their own thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Look, I think there's been a really open and fruitful conversation through the Accord process around the kinds of settings we need to change to make sure that we're serving the students in the best possible way. I'm not going to say all 39 of my universities will say exactly the same thing about harmonisation, but I think there is a real shift in thinking about how we might be able to just make sure that interoperability works better. And remember, there are already 6 universities that are dual sectors. So we've already got 6 of the members, working as close as you can be with TAFE. So I think there's genuine willingness. I think the Accord has been an enormously fruitful process that has opened minds and made people feel confident about having a reform discussion without being terrified that will just mean less resource. I mean, that's been the problem in recent years. We've all been terrified that a reform conversation means less resource, and for TAFE, the less resource problem has been enormous. It's been big for universities, but it's been enormous for TAFE. So I think we can now confidently have a proper discussion around how we best serve the communities we all serve, working better together. And I think there really is open minds and open ears, and from government and from universities and from the TAFE sector as well, and other private vocational providers.
Yeah, and that was certainly the sense I got from the VC sitting around the table yesterday. Yeah, it's interesting. I think what's not fully understood, I think, around community is that whatever happens in higher ed has an immediate impact on the vet sector, TAFE in particular, and probably vice versa. So how we do work together. David, your answer to that question, if you remember it, now you have to go back.
I do remember, Mary, because it was about educational outcomes, which is kind of important in my world, So I guess we need to think about what are we talking about with educational outcomes. If we're talking about the access and we're talking about completions, there's clear evidence that shows better harmonisation from a student perspective leads to better educational outcomes, more likely to succeed, more likely to participate. From an industry perspective, it's a much simpler way of engaging in skills training and qualification development where there is harmonisation. So you're not having to engage with, two warring parents about access to the car. If you could just negotiate access to the car, that's a lot easier. I agree with Kat's comments too. Look, there are so many examples of harmonisation, and our lived experience in South Australia is that absolutely the university VCs and TAFE work incredibly closely together, collaborate, meet far too often probably. But when we start to look at the scale of TAFE compared to 3 universities, there is we're the same size as the 3 universities, and we provide a pathway to university for many people who haven't experienced success within the compulsory sector. We provide a pathway to employment, as do they. And we just recognise there's a different way of operating. We have our strengths. We all have our limitations. And collectively, I think that the outcome is better for students, better for industry, better for government. They get a better return as the funder. And so it's a win-win.
It certainly is a win-win, but let's go to the data that, or someone who can speak about data and what the evidence has actually shown us. So to Simon, NCVER has reported an increase in the number of people coming to TAFE who are degree qualified, and Kat said the same thing, referred to that. Is there research on whether more alignment across TAFE and higher education could be very beneficial for education outcomes and student engagement? Simon, you're also on mute. This is not, come on, panel.
I know. No, I've been working at home for 18 months. I think what would be really useful here is to understand just what type of vet and how people who have graduated from universities are actually accessing and what that looks like over time. Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around the engagement of degree qualified people into the vet sector. So I'm going to just put a couple of caveats. We haven't been able to capture information on all vet activity until relatively recently. So our history goes back to 2016. We can talk about government funded a bit longer back than that, but really to get the full picture here, particularly in this issue, you really need to see the totality of it. For those that aren't familiar with this code that I'm talking here, we're able to capture now all the private or commercial activity and have been since 2016, which is a significant component of vet. It's about half the entire sector in terms of participation. So I'm going to use that data, and what I'm going to do is just give you a sense of the profile of the types of training that people access and the nature of those cohorts to frame the answer to that question. So we do ask a question in our enrolment form of what is the highest level of education people have as they enroll in vet. So we were able to use that data set, which identifies people who are identified as having a bachelor degree or higher. So that's the sort of scope of what we're talking about. And just to give you a sense of scale, over 800,000 degree qualified people enroll in vet every year. That's out of about 4.5 million people in total, all right? And the vast majority of those are over 30 years of old. So 70% of all those people are well past their initial educational experience or post-school educational experience. And the bulk of them are in that prime working age, 30 to 50 years old. That has probably been a feature of vet forever, but we've only now been able to quantify it and see it in all its glory, all right? So I suspect that's always been the case. And of those enrolments, the vast majority of it are in micro-credentials. Now, when I talk micro-credentials, I'm talking a very general grab bag of short courses, single subjects, skill sets, call it what you will. It's not a qualification, is essentially it. And that in itself is about 70% of all students in vet anyway. So the most people are doing these short courses, these single units and the like. And I think the main thing that really needs to be said here is the nature of those micro-credentials are typically what we call occupational licensing. Now, I'm going to use a fairly broad description of that as well. So not necessarily regulated by legislation, although in many cases they are, but a requirement for a job is probably a better way to describe it. So if you look at those 800,000 enrolments by people who have previously been got a bachelor degree or higher, a lot of it's first aid, and that may not be occupationally specific. Might people be doing that for personal interest. But if you start going down the list of those high volume ones, you end up with the responsible service for alcohol, which is a requirement to work in a bar, a white card of construction, which is a requirement for someone to go onto a building site, forklift licenses, and the list just goes on and on and on. So that is by far and away the participation of degree qualified people is in those types of micro-credential subjects. For what it's worth, as a market dominated by private providers, and sorry, Mary, I know it's a TDA conference, but I am going to talk about
absolutely, yes, but go on.
And it's on a commercial basis, so well over 90% of it is not government funded. All right, so this is the sort of activity that's been going on forever, and now we're able to see it. So that's the bulk of it. Has it increased? In other words, have the number of people who have a bachelor degree of higher that are actually participating in VET increased? Yes, substantially over the last 7 or 8 years. The primary reason for that is because there's more people with degrees. So the nature of the cohort probably hasn't changed. It's just that, of course, the general population is now better qualified through university degrees. There is potentially another effect here, and that is the general access and use of micro-credentials has probably also grown over time as well. So if we look at the last couple of years in particular, it's bumped up quite a bit. So I think there's a kind of two effects. One is just a higher qualified population, and the other is a greater awareness, and to some degree a greater requirement, because regulations have been coming in that demand that you do these sorts of units, and that's increased over time as well. So although the bulk of them are micro-credentials, there is a reasonable size cohort, you know, in that 20 to 25% range that also do a VET qualification. Now, again, there is a strong element of occupational licensing on that. So if you look at the top 10, for example, qualifications that people who have got a university education enter into, you'll be interested to know the top one is the TAE. In fact, it's by far and away the most popular course. Then you look.
So what, they're coming to become TAFE teachers, aren't they?
TAFE teachers, exactly.
That's good.
Then there's real estate, which is a licensing issue for many, and that's been around for, you know, decades and decades. Early childhood and education, you can't work in a childcare centre unless you've got a Cert 3 or a diploma. Security operations, the list goes on. So again, it's very much about occupational licensing. There is a reasonable degree of mix of providers in that market, and government funded for qualifications is a bigger share, definitely, of that market. But again, probably in terms of the growth that we're seeing in qualifications for people who are degree educated, it is generally in the private market as well. So I thought that would just set the scene for some of these discussions about this reverse articulation that people.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. Does anyone have a response to what Simon's just talking about? Or would anyone like to respond?
I will, Mary. I think
David?
one of the interesting things that's happening, certainly in our jurisdiction in South Australia, as a result, in response to the fee-free TAFE policy position, which is like everywhere, seen fees removed on a range of TAFE courses or courses delivered at TAFE. We saw a huge uptake of those by reskilling, by people who had qualifications that were taking the opportunity of the government policy. And I think the public is kind of aware that these things come and go. So it's kind of a bit of a now's the opportunity. Taking that opportunity to acquire skills that they had perhaps wanted to, but saw funding as a barrier to being parents, being to their other commitments in life. So if I'm a betting man, which I'm not, but I would be putting money on the fact that there will be a very different statistical outcome as a result of those different policy positions that are now encouraging people to look at returning to study. And there you see, I guess, perhaps a greater willingness or interest in an applied, practical, shorter course than what the traditional credentialing of universities, which is seen to be sort of that multi-year, longer, more extensive commitment. So I think it's a watch this space thing. I do think it'll change, but I was very interested in the stats on it.
Yeah, very interesting. And someone's just commented about the TAE, that TAE is required often in enterprises as well. So it's not necessarily coming to TAFE to teach or to private providers. Peter, do you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just briefly, Mary. So when we look at the numbers of folks who study with us in a VET qualification, then go on to what is sometimes perceived as that linear pathway. You go up the AQF to a degree, and then we look at the numbers of people who study at CQUniversity who actually then move into a vocational qualification. And here I'm not so much talking about those short courses that Simon mentioned. What we see is it's about the same number, more or less. We've looked at it over a couple of years, and also I wouldn't discount those people who perhaps start a degree and then decide, actually, I'm not sure this is for me, and then move into a VET qualification as well. So just some, if you like, some dispatches from the front.
Yeah, I think, Peter, what is interesting is, and we might be able to do a bit of research on this by looking at some of our surveys that ask about why people do what they do, which we don't get through our administrative collection. But if you look at the ones that are doing qualifications, so people have done degrees and then done a VET qualification, it'd be a mixture. It'd be probably more likely that they've had a career change. And that could be, well, for all sorts of reasons. I mean, for women in particular who start families, they don't go into the discipline they might have studied at university, and childcare education assistants, those sorts of jobs often appeal for those reasons. Whereas the micro-credential stuff is a bit more job specific, it's a bit more upskilling on behalf of existing workers, I would have thought, in the main. And or people who want to work while they're studying. So if you want to work in a bar to support your university studies, you still need an RSA. So, there's all sorts of different motivations for this, but I think career changes is a lot of it in the qualification market.
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave that there. But Simon, before I go to Kelly, but Simon, one more, just in regards to, again, from an evidence perspective, is there evidence that supports the idea that underrepresented and marginalised cohort groups benefit more from pathways from TAFE to higher education than those who enter directly?
Yeah, I've got a fairly elaborate references for these things. So you happy for me to spend a bit of time on this one, or do you want to come back to it?
Well, perhaps come back to it. But is there a quick answer to that?
No.
Right. All right. I might come back to it and see if we've got time, because I'd like to sort of go through other go to other panelists, other questions. But I think it is an interesting one because of what Jenny was talking about in regards to, a lot of the targets now about equity and access. So I think we do need to get our heads
I'm
around.
happy to talk about it. I just wasn't sure whether you want to get straight into it or whether you wanted to go down the sort of page that we started with, but I'm happy to talk about it now if you wish. Okay,
but can you be succinct and sort of, don't go into too much detail? Give us a high level answer. Is that possible? No.
Well, I'll give you a short answer now. And of course, the question needs to be kind of interpreted here. And I think David touched upon this quite well. There's sort of two outcomes here. One is actually, does it help to access and enter into higher education? So if you like the articulation piece. The other is, how does it assist you during your higher education in terms of retention and completion? And they are two quite different stories. So I thought I'd focus primarily on how to assist disadvantaged groups get into university, but I can comment a little bit based on the research on the outcomes of those things. I think the main story here is that to use VET as a pathway into higher education, you need to get generally disadvantaged groups up to diploma level, because of course, unless they have a diploma, sometimes a Cert 4, that won't get you into university if you can't get into that level of education. So getting them from where they are, which is often people who have left in year 10 or haven't qualified in year 12, through to a diploma level is actually the bigger challenge, rather than the transfer between that and then. So there's been a couple of research studies that showed that disadvantaged groups aren't accessing the diploma levels, aren't participating in diploma levels at the same rate as non-disadvantaged groups. So even though diplomas are being accessed all over the place, the types of students are typically from middle to high SES backgrounds, and they are using that pathway more into university than disadvantaged groups. That said, I thought I would focus specifically on Indigenous education, because that's such a hot topic with the Accord and also with the National Agreement. And some of the studies showed exactly that effect, that they weren't participating at the higher level, so it wasn't helping them get into university. But I look back over the period where that research was done, which goes back to around about 2010, and it's quite a useful period to actually monitor here, because 2010 was roughly where two major policy changes came in. One was the raised school leaving age and the whole learn and earn type model that got put in across all jurisdictions. And secondly, it was the start of the demand-driven higher education system. So to see what happened between then and now, and one of the really encouraging thing was that First Nations enrolments in Certificate 4 and diplomas increased by well over, by about 60% over that period. So the proportion of First Nations people enrolled in Certificate 4 and diplomas has increased substantially. Their overall participation hasn't changed much, so it's actually at the expense of Cert 1 and Cert 2s by and large. So they are absolutely getting into that AQF level that would give them potentially entry into university. It isn't, though, necessarily translating into entry. And one of the reasons is most of them aren't doing it for that purpose. They're actually doing it for its own outcome, which, of course, is one of the benefits of that pathway, is you can exit with an occupational credential. So it isn't specifically translating into higher university entry. And we know that because the participation of First Nations people in university hasn't grown as much. So that's the short answer.
And I think, yeah, and very interesting. And I think, you know, we do have to make the point that the harmonisation and what we're talking about and what the government's talking about is not only about pathways, because there are genuine exit points, obviously, from vocational qualifications to jobs, etc. But I'd like to come back to this question to the panel. If we're not seeing, you know, marginalised groups, cohorts really accessing the diploma, hence then going into higher ed, which is what Simon's sort of saying, we haven't seen a big increase. What is what the government sort of proposing? Are there any concrete measures that we think could be put in place to actually help that? And what does that actually mean from a harmonisation perspective? But I'll come back, think about that question, because I'll come back to it. I want to go to Kelly. Kelly, firstly, you haven't answered the question, the first question, because you missed it, which is what do you understand harmonisation to mean in this context? And then I'd like you to talk about how does the compulsory education sector through the Department of Education view the difference between TAFE and university delivery, and what would a greater harmonisation mean?
So let's start with the first question. I mean, for me, it starts with having a shared outcome that we're seeking from all of this, that's learner-centric and focuses on lifelong learning. So that you know, essentially, to achieve harmonisation, we've all got to be pushing in the right direction, and allowing then whatever the flexibilities, whatever the different things that are needed to get there are permitted within a flexible system. but without that common kind of goal or outcome kind of starting with, you know, governments and with all stakeholders, I think harmonisation becomes difficult and it gets bogged down, particularly in things like, you know, people not wanting to change something because it might have an impact. I think in one of the previous sessions, there was a mention of kind of AQF and being embedded in awards. Without a common agreement with unions, with employers, with everybody about, well, actually, we do need to change this thing for another purpose, people will just go, well, I don't want to disturb the peace by making change. So for me, that's kind of pretty fundamental to what we're talking about when we talk about harmonisation. I agree with some of the comments from earlier on. It's not integration, and we thought quite carefully when the terms of reference for the Accord were being developed about how do you express what's going on here without making it sound like one is taking over the other. It's a hierarchy. You know, I think the relevant terms of reference talks about the connection between the two and supporting greater engagement and alignment. And for me, that all starts with, well, what are we trying to achieve? Where are we trying to go to steer this ship? And there's lots, again, others have commented on this, there's lots of opportunity at the moment with the Accord, with the National Skills Agreement, with a whole lot of other initiatives to try and forge that common understanding and even language. I'm getting a bit into the barriers here, but even just the common language between the two sectors. When I sit down with different groups of people, you can just hear that where, you know, the dialect is slightly different, and the concerns are slightly different, and that makes it hard to bridge gaps. So on the how does the compulsory education sector, I'm not completely sure I'm qualified to answer this particular question, but I think one of the things that comes out in, I've sat through a lot of Accord consultations, but through a lot of other things, for me is how the compulsory education sector actually understands TAFE and university, not necessarily between the two, but there's a lot of built up, you know, misunderstanding out there that leads into advice given to school age people not being spot on about what they might be capable of doing, where they might go, what the opportunities are. So for greater harmonisation, I think there needs to also be a greater understanding, a more professional understanding within schools, and this has come out in a whole lot of reviews as well, just about what do people understand about the opportunities, and it comes down to the parity of esteem thing as well. It might be far better for someone to, you know, go off and become a mechanic in terms of their, you know, lifelong learning and everything than it might be to become an engineer. But the kind of advice often kids are getting is not so much based on what's best for them, but rather, you know, assumptions about where they should go, family views. I mean, always in these situations, you need to get to mums mostly about, you know, what are the opportunities for their kids, because they'll often help choose what happens, you know, in early high school, which is where people get on track for whether they go to university to vet or just into, you know, straight into the workforce. Are there lessons to be learnt from the schooling sector? As I said, probably not my area of expertise, but I might stop there because really for me it's been those rub points about understanding each other and how, again, if we're going to do this common focus, common goal, we've got to bring the schooling sector into this as well.
Yeah, and I think that was actually mentioned in the other sessions too with Jenny about the schooling sector and with the AQF as well. There's been lots of commentary in regards to, you know, the parity of esteem issue, the language issue and some of the barriers, which if we've got time, we'll sort of talk about a little bit more. But I'd really like to go back to what Simon was talking about before. We've got a problem, which I think Jenny sort of articulated as well. We've got to get more people from equity groups, marginalised groups into education and training, not only for them, but for the community and for, you know, the economy. How does harmonisation help that? So it's a question I'm going to pose to all of you. How does it help? Are we just sort of talking and, you know, because, you know, harmonisation and it's what the Accord's going to say and it's what government's going to say, but when the rubber hits the road, what does it actually mean? So who'd like to go first?
Oh, I will.
Good on you, David.
There's a change. I think going back to that sort of pathways question, Mary, about, you know, are pathways effective? Are they Simon talked about the equity groups not necessarily accessing the diploma, and I think it's kind of a reflection of two issues that I struggle with in our system, which is that sort of linear interpretation of the AQF that is not necessarily required, but the way we have applied the AQF, which sees people having to start at the bottom. I think Megan referred to it as the ladder sort of approach, where you must start at the bottom and work your way up sequentially, unless you can come in and demonstrate that you can come in at a certain level, which fails to recognise the learning that doesn't occur, that does occur outside of formal education and credentialing. So there's that. The other one is fundamentally the qualifications that we deliver in VET are not designed as pathways. They are designed to prepare people for an employment outcome at a particular level, and they're designed by industry for that perspective. When you're designing a bridging program or a pathwaying program in a different context, you wouldn't ask employers unrelated to the outcome to design the curriculum, or design the methodologies of teaching. So I think, you know, that a pathway, that a Cert 4 or a diploma leads to a degree is really about the student has experienced success within a post-compulsory environment and knows some of the independent learning required to be successful. That's the value of that to the success within a higher education program. But they're not aligned, and they're not deliberately providing pathways unless we want to start looking at how we design curriculum and how we integrate the curriculum between you know, a community of education providers. I think that'd be really exciting, but it might undo this whole sort of JSA organisation that's just been created going forward.
There you go. David's suggesting we sort of blow up the whole system. Okay, good on you, David. Other comments anyone would like to make? Kat, what would you like to say?
As a member of the JSA advisory board, I'd like to take, I'd like to pick at that conversation, that comment from David.
Yeah,
JSA's
exactly.
a magnificent organisation. What are you talking about? Look, I think there are a couple of useful and interesting things to think about. I've been having a little bit of an eye on the chat as well, and I've got to say, one of the correspondents on the chat says this conversation hasn't really evolved very much through the Accord panel. And look, I don't think that's wrong. But at the same time, I think the Accord was always enormously ambitious, you know, 9 months to really answer every single question, not just in university education, but in, you know, tertiary education. So I think we can see the period after the Accord, the final paper's been submitted as a really good time to actually get down to nuts and bolts and work out how we do this thing called harmonisation, how we actually work out, you know, better ways of streamlining between pathway, between whatever you want to call it. But also, I think there are a couple of things we need to really think about. A proper framework for recognition of prior qualifications, so that, you know, you can really work out how it is you stack things together. I mean, for universities, there's a large amount of autonomy, and there should be, in terms of how they decide to admit people, because they best understand their circumstances and their communities and whether the students are ready to go into the degree. So I wouldn't want to put this into a sort of a rigid formula, which means, you know, there's no autonomy left for universities to exercise over what is adequate, but a framework for recognition of prior learning, I think, would be a high level framework, would be a really good idea. One of the things we suggested in the Accord, but there are so many more good conversations to have here. And we keep on having the same conversation kind of again and again and again. I mean, to do it, it's a really good idea. I mean, people like Simon and David have actually got a really good grasp, and bless his soul, Peter Noonan, unfortunately no longer with us, had a good grasp on what you actually need to do. We need to move from that, it's a good idea, to actually starting to do it. I think that's a next year task.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think it's probably part of the Tertiary Education Commission bringing people together and looking at providers in a very different way. And I think hopefully that will get to the point of, you know, starting to break down some of those parity of esteem issues. It's about, you know, where students want to go, not whether it's higher ed. And there's been a lot of commentary about, you know, the use of higher ed and all sorts of things there. Do other people want to make a comment? Other panelists, because I'm soon going to be handing over to Jenny. Kelly.
I'm a bit of an optimist, because otherwise I wouldn't have worked as long as I have in the public service. And I think, you know, yeah, we may have been having the same conversation, but sometimes you do need to have it over again. But I think there's, you know, there's signs of green shoots from governments where they're putting down payments on moving towards harmonisation. Now, they may not be the straight kind of strategic route that you might expect, but that, as Catriona has said, that would come after these big reviews. But things like the TAFE Centre of Excellence and higher apprenticeships work, where you've actually got DUA and education jointly working together, and then working with states and territories. The National Skills Passport, yes, it's only developing a business case, but equally it's about this collaborative working together, rather than what often happens in government is we dream stuff up, go through a budget process and it gets announced. We may have done some consultation along the way, as well as the work on placements and support for placements. Not quite on topic, but it's in similar vein. So I think I'm a little bit more optimistic that we actually are starting to see some progress towards that common understanding and that common goal. And from that can come a lot.
I agree. I'm quite optimistic, and I think, as you mentioned, I think the centres of excellence, I think the higher quals, an appetite to look at things differently is a way forward. Simon?
Well, yeah, I was just picking up on the optimism thing, and we do beat ourselves up a little bit. If you look more broadly across decades, and I'll start with a somewhat glib reference to people who are going into university, you might remember you had to do a separate matriculation exam. There was about 100 people in each state that actually qualified to get in there. It was a fairly elite access to a university education. And if you really look back at where we've got to over that time, and including how you get into higher education at the moment, there's a massive change in the pathways of getting into the education. People having an ATAR is now under 50%, for example. So we've as a system developed a whole.
Not sure that's a good thing, is it? But
a whole range of pathways, and that has improved access. There's no question about that. It starts with schools, it goes through vet, and then you end up, you know, in the higher level education. So I think we need to at least kind of acknowledge that we've improved things. It is an evolutionary thing, though. It takes a long time to change these things. Shouldn't stop us from actually focusing on it, but it's also, it would be unreasonable to say we haven't achieved anything either, because we have.
yeah, I agree. And I think also, you know, I think to maintain the optimism and enthusiasm for some change. And I recall when Bradley report came out, there was a lot of real momentum at that point in time about tertiary. Perhaps the time now is to really embrace some of that change. Peter, and then that'll be the last comment, because I do have to hand over to Jenny. Peter.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I just wanted to echo what other panelists have mentioned in terms of of an optimistic outlook. Currently we have broad alignment between the states and the federal government. That has not been the case for many, many years. The Accord process has quite pleasingly focused on not just higher ed, but has been quite inclusive of vocational training. I think the language is changing, I should say. Witness the Accord's narrative of, or indeed this discussion of a harmonised, joined up approach. The National Skills Agreement, which just literally come out the last day or so, seems to be putting the federal and state government's money towards lifting a focus, particularly on vocational training, which is great to see. We heard today about the new AQF framework, which has got a lot of focus on a much less hierarchical and more equitable framework. And I would argue, perhaps most importantly, parties are talking openly about that truism that we educators have known for a long time, in that actually the best learning happens when you combine theory and practice, where you actually practice what you're doing. And really, we're seeing that through much more focus on higher level apprenticeships and a range of other initiatives. So I'm eternally optimistic.
On that very optimistic note, Jenny, we're going to hand over to you. But firstly, I'd like to thank the panellists today for their input into this discussion. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you very much. And I think that was a great session. So thank you. We are now at 4:26. Our close time is 4:30. So can we just join? I know you're all clapping, but thank you to Mary for chairing a really interesting conversation. I think we could have gone on and on. There was quite a lot of questions in the Q&A. But I think Peter finished us on such a high note. We will probably finish on a high note. So thank you. I think we are at a moment of change. And even though it might feel incremental, there's some positivity there. Thank you to David for your contributions and your genuine enthusiasm for how things are different. Pat, I've really enjoyed working with you this year. Thank you to Universities Australia for being part of this panel. Simon, that bit you talked about on First Nations was really insightful, along with some of the other data you gave. So thank you very much for participating today. And Kelly, sorry I didn't get in initially, but some of that contribution about your broader thinking around what harmonisation means and what you're seeing as you've done through the Accord panel has been really useful. So thank you in contributing today. And of course to Mary, for framing the conversation and for asking and teasing out such great questions. So to you all, a great big thank you. So that brings us to the end of our half-day online conference from TDA. Again, thank you to My Equals, who was the sponsor for this event. We will be sending out a short survey in the coming days to seek your feedback on the event. Recordings will be available in November. This site remains open for a couple of weeks, so you can get some of the PowerPoints, etc., from this site if you so choose. 2 promos from TDA as well. The first is that the TDA convention next year opens for registrations on Monday, and that will take place in Sydney from the 8th to the 9th of May. Also, call for proposals opens on Monday. We look forward to lots of people putting up their hand for call for proposals. And the next TDA 1 hour webinar is on Wednesday, the 15th of November, our TAFE Talk series. And this is about student experience and what makes for a positive student experience. So that now brings us to the end of Linkages, One Tertiary Education System, our half-day online conference. Thank you to all our speakers and thank you to all the people who registered and attended. I think it was a rich conversation. So enjoy the rest of the day, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks. See ya.